One of the eternal conversations amongst gamers, particularly in the tabletop RPG community, is RAW versus RAI, R-A-W, R-A-I, rules as written versus the rules as intended. There's always going to be a divide. Language is an imprecise tool. So when the rules say do X, sometimes X is a little fuzzy. Like, what exactly does X mean? And what does it mean to do X, as opposed to be X, or have X, or become X? And so some amount of interpretation must necessarily be done. This is more true for some games than for others. It is particularly it is particularly pertinent. Hey, words, you got to use the right ones, as we were about to find out. It's particularly pertinent to communities surrounding 5th edition D&D because 5th edition uses what they call natural language rules writing, which is to say that instead of having like rigid formats and templates that have specific defined meanings, it mostly just uses common English, and you are meant to interpret it the way you would interpret a normal sentence. The issue is that English, especially, is a very imprecise language. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of different ways to read things if you're not super duper careful. And hey, check this out. Wizards of the Coast, at least their D&D department, is not super duper careful. The Magic the Gathering department actually has templating down to like a science. Like, Magic the Gathering is very precisely worded in every aspect. I suspect those two departments don't really talk to each other that much. So what happens when you have multiple interpretations of what a rule is supposed to mean? Well, there's a sort of default interpretation, which is like this fits the text. It grammatically fits. And it also seems the most likely and the most reasonable. Sometimes you have a clear rules as written interpretation. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you must interpret, you must decide, did they mean this or did they mean this? I think they mean this. And sometimes, so there's that. There's interpreting the rules to mean what you think they likely meant. Which is a weakness of natural language rules writing that I think is largely understated in the community these days. The amount of extra work that players have to do to decide what the rules even mean is, in my book, unacceptable. But more to the point, a lot more arguments tend to arise when the rules as written actually disagree with the rules as intended. That is, the way that the rules seems to want you to play is actually not what the words say. You have to do something different than what the words say to make the game work the way that it seems like it probably is supposed to. And there are those who think that you can determine what rules as intended are. Like, clearly, holy heck, ripped my shirt. You can clearly see what the writers were intending here, and therefore you shouldn't run it rules as written. You should run it rules as intended. There's a big problem there, which is A, you can't know what the writers meant. You just can't. Particularly when it comes to Wizards of the Coast writing for D&D. There's been so many times when it's like, well, clearly they mean this. And then it turns out, like in an interview or in a clarification or FAQ or an errata or an update, no, they actually meant it the other way. The way that seemed crazy, the way clearly that's not right. No, actually it is. That is what they meant. This has come up recently with Nice Tools Magic Aura. There was a tech interpretation, which is like an unintuitive interpretation, a way that seemed exploitative, and was generally regarded as not being rules as written or rules as intended. It was rules as written, but not as an unintended consequence. Well, in the 2024 books, it's made more explicit that this is definitely the way that it works. They like almost practically came out and said, you can do this thing that seemed pretty shady to do. And hey, check it out. You're going to get some background noise as I turn on my AC because it's hot as hell out here. And I'm not done talking. I am not done talking. Yeah, hear the beeping of my car telling me you're on battery powered, bud. So, where the heck was I? So there's an example of the writers basically coming out and saying, no, actually the as intended was not what we intended. We intended it to be the way that it was written. Okay, that's weird. So, like, and there's been lots and lots of instances like that, where the rules say one thing, the community at large says, well, they clearly mean this other thing, obviously. Like, they can't mean that. And then the writers end up clarifying, either in an update or an FAQ or something, like, yeah, actually, they did mean it that way. So, I don't think you can ever really know with certainty what the writers intended. And even if you could, different people think that they can simultaneously in different ways. You know, what seems obvious to you is not obvious to everyone. That's why we try to write rules with clarity. And in fact, the writers might mean different things at different times, or even like as a team, part of the team might mean one thing and part of the team might mean another. Like the human brains are like really imprecise when it comes to this. I should know I'm writing an RPG and there are times when like rules or abilities come up and one of the players is like, well, what's this supposed to mean? And I'm like, I don't remember writing that, much less what I was thinking when I did. Oh my gosh. Memory is a funny thing. And I think expecting the writers of D&D, something as massive as D&D, because D&D is a very big, complicated system with lots of little parts. And I think expecting the writers to know what they were thinking when they wrote it and have a consistent, eternal interpretation of what it's supposed to mean and what it's supposed to do, what, like the intention behind the rule, I think it's an unreasonable expectation at the best of times. In particular with 5th edition, I don't think that they put that much thought into it in the first place. But even if they did originally, like it's hard, it's really hard to have a continuous, consistent intention behind something you wrote maybe years ago. Like, for 5 minutes you were working on this before you send it off to the editor. You know, it's like, and I'm sure it gets looked over more than once. Like it's like, obviously Wizards of the Coast has a different writing process than I personally do. But the point is that what the writers intended is largely irrelevant. It A, can't be determined, and B, probably isn't even that consistent, and C, probably isn't what you think it is. So, what are we to do? In a game like 5th edition, you kind of have to go for whatever seems most reasonable to your particular group. Now, that seems like a no-brainer, seems obvious. Like, that's probably what most people do by default, without even thinking about whether or not they are right. But the frustration you're going to run into there is if you think you know how the rules work, and then you try to go to another table and say, I know how to play D&D, and it turns out they do things different than you do, or than you ever have, and haven't even questioned about it, then you're going to run into a lot of issues there. Like, I thought I knew how to play D&D. Apparently I don't. This group does it differently. Well, which one's right? And then you go online and find out, actually, neither is right or wrong. They're both just interpreting. And so they aren't really playing the same game then, are they? 5th edition tends to be a lot of sort of suggestions, these ideas, these sort of concepts and notions that you take and you say, all right, we're going to make a game out of this. Which feels wrong for such a big, expensive, like, flagship product. But maybe that's just me. Other games tend not to be this way. Most games that are as big and as crunchy as D&D tends to take more templated and more gamified approach to the rules, so that it is easier to interpret and you can have a more consistent play experience across tables. And there's a lot less guesswork in the meantime. Where you get a lot of natural language rules writing, and still, I think, generally not even as much as 5th edition, is with the narrative-focused games like Powered by the Apocalypse games, to an even lesser extent, maybe even Blades in the Dark type games, those kinds of things where it's like the rules are pretty loose and light, and they're there really to facilitate the narrative. Those kinds of games tend to use more natural language rules, particularly when they have mechanics for where like the consequences of a roll may be purely narrative, in which point you're not using game mechanics, you are describing a situation or a consequence. D&D doesn't really have that. D&D is still a pretty crunchy game. And so it feels like the natural language model for rules writing doesn't really fit very well at all. And it creates these problems where you have to determine between rules as written and rules as intended. And different groups are going to come up with different solutions and different answers for what things mean. So anytime I see a discussion about, like, you know, is this raw? Is this RAI? Is this, you know, is this the way that the game is supposed to be played? I kind of balk at the concept, the notion that rules as intended can even be determined. It's probably not even worth discussing what is or what might be intended, because you can't find an answer. And it's ultimately not even relevant because each table might do it differently. So that's my thing. I think you kind of have to just go off of rules as written as much as possible and default to running the game the way that it is written, unless the table makes a conscious decision to do otherwise. I think that's the most reasonable way to approach RPGs and interpreting the rules.